Hey, hey, what you doing? Oh, I'm just doing a booty band workout. Oh, why? Oh, I'm trying to build up my glutes. That's not a very effective option. What? You want to build a booty? You probably want to ditch that band. Let me explain why. Training your glutes has become all the rage. People have transitioned from doing general lower body exercises to really emphasizing glute training. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the problem is that a lot of people implement it very incorrectly. So let's break it down. A booty band, or loop, is some sort of resistance device that utilizes elastic resistance to provide an increased challenge to movements. Booty bands come in different shapes, different sizes, different materials, and different colors. Generally, bands come as a single resistance. However, now we're seeing new bands come on the market that offer a range of resistance. Booty bands offer an increased challenge to movements through elastic resistance. Commonly, people will utilize bands during their warm-up in an attempt to activate their glutes more as they do different movements like bridges, abductions, clamshells, or even walking exercises. Now, it's definitely possible that you will increase the amount of glute utilization during these movements with a band. However, it's primarily because you're just increasing the amount of resistance to these different movements. However, that point's not unique to the bands. If I were to look at a normal squat, if I increase resistance to it, such as doing a goblet squat over bodyweight squat, I'd also increase the amount of activation out of my glutes. The next way a lot of people will utilize bands is through their actual workout, adding it onto movements in an attempt to increase the amount of challenge on their glutes during the movements, such as hip thrusts, squats, jumping, and even running. Now, some of these movements are reasonable to add a glute loop to for additional resistance. In contrast, some of these movements are actually probably better off not having. While the premise of adding a loop to a movement and increasing the challenge on the glutes is understandable, we need to consider what the primary job of the glutes are in the movement. Because if the loop takes away from that, then it negates the actual benefit of the primary exercise that we're aiming to do. Let's use the hip thrust as a first example to understand where it might be appropriate to use a loop band. When we look at the hip thrust, this is an exercise where our primary function is going to be focusing on hip extension utilizing our glutes, with the most challenging position going to be right around the lockout position, so nearing hip extension. In this position, we don't really have a high demand on hip abduction or external rotation. So theoretically, adding in a band that's going to allow us to then maintain our position and go through a hip thrust is a reasonable choice. On the flip side, we have an exercise like the squat, where as I come to hip extension, there's a minimal challenge on the glutes. Contrary, as I go down deeper into hip flexion, there's an increased demand on the glutes. And we can see this in research when they look at how much hypertrophy changes do we see with different squat depths, where deeper ranges of squatting produce greater results for glute changes in muscle. And that's why squatting to deeper depth needs to be a big priority in squats, especially for glute growth. And that's where, with these bands, we often see individuals struggle in getting to a sufficient depth. Most commonly, you'll see people squatting quarter squats, half squats maybe, instead of getting that full depth where we see the best outcomes for glute growth. Another challenge we see is that when you start to add external resistance, utilizing a barbell, etc., when most research studies have looked at this, people have theorized that by adding this external resistance, it cues people to drive their knees out. However, if our primary job during the squat is to go down and then stand back up, we're going to be emphasizing hip extension, driving and getting the hip straight at the top. And that's where this additional motion becomes an irrelevant challenge, something that almost takes away from our primary task. And therefore, having that external resistance tends to be a negative result. Because when they look at this, people have an increased knee adduction position when they squat with a band on their knees versus without. So if your goal is glute growth with squats, you want to ditch this band. You want to put more weight on the bar and focus on getting deep. This can also be a problem for movements like hip thrusts, where it's reasonable to utilize a glute band. However, individuals go overboard. Instead of utilizing a lighter, reasonable resistance that they can manage, they ditch that and they go to a heavier one that starts to actually limit the motion. Here they've got a resistance band on that when they go up, pulls their knees inwards and actually overloads them from maintaining their inline position and getting full extension. In contrast, they're just fighting to keep their knees out the whole time, not locking out and not getting the primary focus of this exercise, hip extension. We need to consider that not every exercise is a glute exercise. Even when the glutes might be active during a movement, they might not be the focus of that exercise. As well, during exercises where the glutes are being challenged, we might just want to work on extension or just general motions, not trying to increase the demand on abduction and external, having these bands drag our knees inwards. Exercises like jumps are a great example where our primary focus is on speed and power, not fighting my knees from falling in as I do the movement. Sure, I want to maintain a good alignment to produce maximal power, but this is increasing that resistance in a way that doesn't transfer over when I take the band off. Another example is running, where individuals will put a band around their knees with the intent of having more active glutes while they run. In reality, while it doesn't increase the resistance as I push back, utilizing my glutes to a higher degree as we discussed, it also increases the resistance for me to flex my hip, which is going to be not desirable and take away from my ability to get a sufficient stride length, etc. So instead of having this band around my knees, I'd be better off trying to get a further stride length, increase my velocity, increase my running distance, or having a band around my waist if I really want to focus on that push-off. The last way that we see a lot of individuals utilize loop bands is going to be for more direct targeted strengthening of the hip in abduction and external rotation. Doing exercises like side-lying hip abductions, clamshells, and the various other movements that we can do that emphasize hip abduction and external rotation is a much more reasonable and intelligent way to utilize these bands. During exercises where we're emphasizing hip extension, we're able to target hip extension by having resistance that aligns with that. Same with when we do exercises where we're trying to focus on hip abduction and external rotation, having a resistance that meets that is going to be optimal for then getting the most out of the glutes. To summarize, glute bands are overutilized. In the majority of cases, we'd be best off throwing them away and focusing on the exercise at hand as it is. In exercises like squats, hip thrusts, prioritizing putting more weight on the bar, getting more reps, getting a better lockout position, better depth, etc. will lead over to better glute gains than just slapping a band on. On the flip side, on exercises where you're able to isolate the hip, focus on hip abduction, hip external rotation, utilizing a band is very reasonable there. You got that gray zone of certain exercises like hip thrusts and glute bridges where your glute hip abduction and external rotation could be increased resistance, but you want to minimize how much resistance you add on. Don't slap a really aggressive band on. Use a light one and then work your way up as you still maintain technique and focus on getting more resistance in the hip extension action. Thank you for watching. Let us know if you want additional videos covered down in the comments below. Like this video, make sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.